Hello, my name is David Lesser. I have the privilege to interview Fred Danforth, the first director of the New Haven Legal Assistance Association. Today is September 16th, 2013. This interview is part of the Connecticut Bar Foundation's James W. Cooper Fellows History of Legal Services in Connecticut project. Fred, tell us something about your early life and before you came to the Legal Services Program.
Well, I grew up in Buffalo, New York. Went to school there through high school, then went on to college.
Where'd you go to college?
Princeton. Mm-hmm. And I went to law school and came back to Buffalo and practiced in a large firm for a while, then in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I worked with the Department of Justice doing tax fraud litigation. And at that point, it was the late 50s, I decided that I wanted to be a law teacher. And I went to NYU to get a graduate degree to try to beef up my resume a little.
What was your graduate degree in?
Criminal law. It was a LLM. I don't know exactly how it was specified. And then I was fortunate. I got a job teaching criminal law and evidence at American University in Washington, D.C.
And how did you get from there into the legal services
Well, I
program?
met a person well known in legal services now, a guy named Gary Bello, who was as a public defender down there, and we became good friends, and he asked for a talk. We always had morning talks at breakfast. And he said he'd been offered a job of being the executive director of a new organization in New Haven, funded by Ford, focusing on neighborhood law. And, well, what did I think of it? So we talked and all. It sounded very interesting. And he went on and he accepted the position. This is the summer of 1964. And then he called a week later and said, Fred, I'm not going to be able to take that job. It's funny how life has turned.
Because he took the one in California.
Yeah, I don't know. He went there and then he went on to Harvard Law School, and became very important in legal services. He was a very able guy. Would you be interested? And I said, gee, I think I would. My thought was that I'd do it for a few years and it would broaden my teaching experience into a new area that I really didn't know anything about. And the long and the short of it was, my wife and I, and young daughter, moved to New Haven in September of 1964. And that's when it started.
And who did you meet with?
I first met with Joe Goldstein and Frank Deneen.
How come?
Well, Frank had been with the program for a bit.
The Legal Aid Bureau.
Yeah, the Bureau. And Joe was a consultant. As I think people know, Joe was the one that recommended to the Ford Foundation that in their neighborhood centers, in neighborhood schools to set up to attack poverty, they add a lawyer. And then he became actually a consultant of ours, and he was very valuable. I think I also met with Charlie Parker and Jim Cooper, who were on the board.
Charlie and Jim being in private practice at the Tyler Cooper firm.
They were the ones that really got New Haven Legal Assistance off the ground.
But how did they pick you? It wasn't just through Gary Bello, was it?
I really can't answer that. I don't know.
You just got the call one day.
I got a call. I came up while I interviewed. We talked. I don't know.
And after you met with Joe and Frank and Charles Parker, Jim Cooper,
sure.
Did you develop a vision for what you wanted the program to be?
I don't think I did. I knew very little about legal services for the poor. You go through law school and you're certainly with a big firm, and you listen to my experience. It hadn't taught me any of that. And as you know, the course in law school is creditors' rights, not debtors' rights, as they say. But I think the first vision I had when I started really getting into it was this vision that people really couldn't negotiate the legal system, particularly the courts, without the assistance of a lawyer.
What did you, when you first came to New Haven, and I take it this would have been in the late summer or the fall of 1964?
Yes, I visited a little bit in August. I think we actually moved here in September.
What was some of your first impressions of both the support that you were going to get, where that was coming from, and some of the opposition that you faced, and where that seemed to come from, and how you dealt with that?
I think we certainly had support of the lawyers in the larger firms. Most of them, not all of them.
Parker and Cooper.
And there were several at Wigan and Dana and others. That was very supportive. We had good support from a number of people at Yale Law School, including Gene Rostow, the dean, and others there. That was very
And was
helpful.
Joe Goldstein helpful with?
Joe was extremely helpful. Jim Greenfield, who practiced in a small firm, was very supportive, and there were some of them were supportive. It wasn't until later that I really began to appreciate the type of opposition we were going to run into.
And when was that? When did that opposition first begin to surface? How did it manifest?
Late September, early October, but there was an October bar meeting of the New Haven County Bar Association.
In 64.
In 64. And I was invited to come over there and speak. And the vote was that I was to be literally booted out of the room because I wasn't a member of the New Haven County Bar Association.
Did you go to the meeting?
Yeah, I went to the meeting that I was invited to, and I got thrown out. So I waited in the hall, and you could hear through the doors a lot of pretty heavy talk back and forth. And Frank Deneen came out and said, "Fred, they want you to come back in, but watch out." So I went in there, and we had a discussion for about an hour about legal services.
When you say discussion, who was?
Well, there were questions coming at me from the floor. Said, "How are you going to be sure you're not going to represent people who have money? Why are you doing criminal work when we have a public defender?" One of the things I liked about the program is that in the neighborhood offices, they wouldn't distinguish between the labels civil and criminal, which we thought one would help give a choice and bring some dignity to that. Plus, there was a relationship often between the two. You're a corporation, aren't you? And you know that corporations can't practice law. Of course, Legal Aid has been a corporation for many years, and public defender, in effect, is hired by the state of Connecticut, which is a corporation. And there were these issues that were raised. I think they were. My recollection is that there may have been 10, 12, 15 lawyers that were really against this for a variety of reasons. And that they'd stirred up enough to put fear into some lawyers that we were going to end up taking business from them.
But eventually, most of that opposition it took some years, didn't it, Fred? But eventually, a lot of that opposition dissipated as people saw that, the sky was.
Well, I think what happened was they appointed a committee to study us, and there was a period till the second meeting in November, during which time, whenever I would go out to talk to various groups, there was an investigator in the front row tape recording me, hoping I'd make an ethical or legal mistake. And our offices were broken into. And I don't know for sure. I suspect that if not the local bar, some members of it were behind that. At the second meeting, I was voted out again. And then there was some technical problem with the vote. So
did you have to take the bar exam for it?
Yeah, I had to take the bar exam. Remember, Kurt Thompson Warren Barkley recommended that you could get in on 5 years practice. Yeah. But I hadn't really had a solid type of practice, so I took the bar, yes. The Bar Association at that meeting actually voted down New Haven Legal Assistance. several hundred or something. There were about 400 people there the second.
Was it a big lopsided majority?
Yeah, but when you say things then got better, they also referred it to the unauthorized practice section of the state bar.
Oh.
And in, I think, March or April of 65, they gave us a clean bill of health. And said it was really in the best traditions of the bar. That was the...
Fred, let me ask you, the Legal Aid Bureau had existed for decades.
Yes.
Before the New Haven Legal Assistance Program.
Yes, it was run by the city of New Haven.
Yes, and Frank Deneen had been the lawyer, the only full-time lawyer at the Legal Aid Bureau since really 1961.
Well, since it began.
Since it began, I guess. And he certainly did not have a reputation in the private bar for cooperative behavior, especially when it came to summary process action. So how do you explain the increased intensity of opposition to the New Haven program if the Legal Aid Bureau had always been there?
Well, the Legal Aid Bureau, up until, I think, early 64, just about the time that we started, had only been a part-time lawyer. Frank had been in one of the neighborhood offices that had started earlier and had to close down because of that Cloud case and all. And
what was the Cloud case?
Well, the Cloud case was a case where the Community Progress, which is the anti-poverty agency, had offices out in the two schools, Winchester and County School, with these teams of people to attack poverty, including a lawyer, as Joe had recommended. And one day a black woman called up Jean Kahn, who was in one of the offices. She was in one, Frank was in the other, and asked Jean if she could help represent her son, who had just been accused of raping a white nurse. Mm-hmm. Now, the rule was that they were supposed to actually do work on cases that was more of a triage or referral. Mm-hmm. But Jean talked Mike Smirnoff, the head of it, into it. Mm-hmm. And she went and sat and helped the public defender, who was also part-time at that time. And it created an immense publicity against Community Progress, all that Dick Lee was trying to do in town. So that's what spun off the New Haven Legal Assistance. And then so Frank basically was out of a job in that context. And it was then in early 64 that he moved over to the New Haven Legal Aid Bureau, and with money from us became full-time. So he really hadn't started his work until about the time we started. So
at that time, when he moved over to the Legal Aid Bureau, right, which was in City Hall, was he still considered part of the city?
He was a city employee.
And New Haven Legal Assistance, obviously, was not a city employee.
Correct.
What was your relationship with the political structure?
Not bad. Not bad. I remember
Lee and Arthur Barberi and the Democratic Party. Yeah. And how did that work?
It worked okay. Charlie Parker took me over early to meet Dick Lee. Mm-hmm. And very charming guy, you may know. And he said, "Fred, you're a Republican, aren't you?" Dick Lee, long-time Democrat. And I said, "Yes, I grew up as a Republican. And all, but I said my focus here with this program is I really want to keep it independent of politics." And he said, "Well, Fred," he said, that's a very noble goal. But he said, "At times you may have to compromise. You've got to understand that to run the city, I have to keep the Charlie Parkers on one arm and the Art Barberis, the head of the party, on the other. And it's a tough thing." And I said, "I understand." We had a good chat. He never interfered with the program.
He did get mad.
Indirectly, he got mad. He called me up one day and he said, "Fred, who's this guy John Dorman? I don't know him." He was a lawyer we hadn't grown up in Connecticut. And during the riots, we had pretty good credibility in the neighborhoods.
Yes, we did.
And the chief of police came over and we had a meeting on that. They wanted us to take on some of their responsibilities. But no, Dick never really interfered.
Even when the city was a defendant?
You know, surprisingly, the city wasn't a defendant that much. It was when we got into that litigation against state entities, it was more the state agency. I never heard a complaint from Dick on that.
Now, the Legal Aid Bureau was concentrated downtown in
Correct.
the City Hall building, but one of the main contributions that you made as director of New Haven Legal Assistance was to establish neighborhood offices.
Correct.
How did you decide to do that, and where these offices would go, and who would staff them, and because these were among the first in the country?
Let me just say first that it's, I think by '66, we took over the Legal Aid Bureau.
I see.
And it actually became a part of LA, became our central office.
Mm-hmm.
And with Frank, and then we had other lawyers in there too. We had more lawyers there. Caseload was picking up. And Frank would be the primary trainer of new lawyers that came in. Well, the neighborhood law office concept was actually the Ford Foundation concept. So that was built into the program that we were going to have neighborhood law.
And was that from Ford, or
Ford.
did OEO?
No,
have that
OEO
idea?
hadn't started then.
I see.
OEO started after the Civil Rights, well, not the Civil Rights Act, but the poverty, the new poverty law signed by Johnson in '64.
Because I remember the Congress Avenue neighborhood office where I ended up working.
Right.
Opened, I think, in the spring of '65, didn't it?
Correct, May 1st.
Yeah. Oh, you remember that.
It was right
May
after
1st.
we got the approval of the state bar.
Yeah.
We moved, and we had two lawyers working with us then. They were in training with Frank. One was Charlie Gill, who was the lawyer that opened up Congress Avenue, and the other was Leander Gray,
Yes.
who went and opened up Newhall, both in May of '65.
I remember our seeing one another at the opening of the Congress Avenue office with Justice Goldberg.
Yes, got
How did you get him up there?
I think through Joe. Brought him up there. So that was where the neighborhood, the city had, because it had done a lot of redevelopment in the 50s, primarily of buildings and everything, had divided the city into neighborhoods. And there was the Hill neighborhood and the Newhall neighborhood and all of Worcester Square neighborhood. So we opened an office, one each, in two of those neighborhoods.
Yes.
And we just hunted for a good spot that was cheap and very, very accessible. That's one of the things the bar was upset at. They felt that it diminished the dignity.
Yes.
Lawyers were working out of what used to be a pool hall or a...
I can imagine how they would feel that way. And who were the first lawyers in the program, and how did they come to be chosen?
Well, Charlie was actually chosen before I got here. He was a native guy, and so he was here. I don't remember how I heard of Leander Gray. I remember I actually interviewed him in Washington, D.C. And I don't remember. I remember a lot of the lawyers, but I don't remember what order people came in. But we did some looking, but most came to us. It was a very exciting time to start out. And
it was. I remember applying to you and getting interviewed and everything.
A lot of them, and I don't remember whether you did it, had been Yale law students working with us.
Yes.
And some of them stayed on.
Yes. I worked for Roger Kuntz as a student.
Sure.
Roger graduated.
Sure.
I think he came in after Charlie.
Could be. He was one of the early ones, I think.
And what difference, in your opinion, did having offices in the neighborhood and having lawyers more as a part of the community, what difference did that make in terms of the delivery of legal services, say contrasted with a downtown legal aid bureau?
Well, I never really tested that empirically.
No, but what do you think?
I think that there was a great feeling of discomfort of going downtown to offices if you were poor, disadvantaged, and I don't think it was a friendly experience, and it very often wasn't, and certainly the courts were. So you had people right out with you. And it took a while to have the business start. But once it started, with word of mouth, it really expanded.
Yes.
But I think it was probably a perception problem.
And then over the course of really not more than a couple of years, you were able to open up not only more neighborhood offices, but to add to the staff in each. How were you able to do that?
Well, that's when OEO came in, the federal money. That was the major thing. And plus the National Legal Aid and Defender Association gave us.
But this became somehow one of the more favored programs for funding in the country.
I felt that way.
And how were you able to manage that? What was it about?
Well, I think we were getting good results. We were also willing to experiment a little with what they wanted. For example, you say we opened up additional offices. Over that 5-year period from 65 to 70, we were up to 5 neighborhood offices.
Yes.
3 of them were actually very contiguous to each other. They had Congress Avenue. A few blocks away there was one on Howard Avenue, and a few blocks away there was one on Lincoln.
Yes.
And they all developed their own caseload, and one of the things we learned was that proximity to the office was a big factor. So it wasn't just proximity between neighborhood and downtown. Proximity.
Yes.
Because they both filled up very quickly. And then the issue came, well, what are you doing? You just being a Band-Aid on problems? I mean, nothing's changing out here, really. Just everything's reoccurring. And that's when we decided to segregate several lawyers to do law reform, what you went on to do, and had the balance. We still kept the feeling that the best way to decide our priorities was who walked in the door.
Yes.
We kept that. OEO disagreed with it later on, but we kept that that was the best.
And I remember there were a lot of discussions within our program about how to handle that problem.
Yeah, we had many discussions. It's a very difficult.
And we all participated.
Very difficult problem. The other thing we did is we experimented with Judicare in one of our offices where, although we had a full-time attorney there to manage it and do some work, people that came in had a choice between that attorney and a panel of private attorneys that we would pay. And we experimented with that.
And were these, how did you get those private attorneys to serve?
We advertised. Just said, this is what we're going to do, and those interested would sign up.
And were they paid?
Yes.
And how were they paid?
Our money.
How do you think that worked out?
I think it worked out all right. I think everyone agreed in the end that it was more expensive to do it that way. And of course you don't have the specialization that you spend a year or two in a neighborhood office.
Did you find that the cases coming up from the neighborhoods gave you some headaches with friction from the bar or maybe state or local government?
Yes.
What kinds of
well, most of the friction would come either from lawyers who would be on the other sides of cases, particularly landlord-tenant. You mentioned Frank Deneen and his work. Yes. By that time, Frank had become very, very good at landlord-tenant law, and that presented a real problem for landlords' lawyers, many of which didn't have a lot of money either. We represented some landlords, actually, that qualified. There was also some disagreement that with our criminal work, there was a feeling that if you gave an full representation, it encouraged crime, just like legal aid encourages poverty. And we had that kind of opposition. But the bar opposition stayed with us for a while.
But not the city government.
City government, no.
And
Barberry was very quiet.
Yes. When did you had mentioned earlier you started running into some conflict with the state agencies or government. What was behind
Well,
that?
in the 70s, first of all, I should mention that we had a very good relationship with Chief Judge Rubinow of the Circuit Court.
Mm-hmm.
And we helped him set up a public defender office for that court. The no bail program, where people were let out in their own recognizance if they had community ties. And that, we had a very good relationship at that level. And so he could help us from time to time. Well, the state problems began when Governor Meskel became governor. Mm-hmm. And the funding from the federal government changed some, so that some of it would actually go through the states, and the states would have a say in it. And Meskel one was not in favor of our program, generally speaking, and there were times that we were involved with the state litigation, primarily with welfare.
And did you find that with the state having some control over the purse strings, that they wanted to use that control as a carrot and a stick? How did you respond?
I didn't see any carrots. Well, the first thing they did is they solicited complaints about us. And there are a whole bunch of complaints, I don't know, a couple dozen, 30. And they appointed Hub McDonald, who was on the Supreme Court, was chairing the committee on all this stuff, and he wasn't a big fan of ours, I would say. And then they appointed a local judge, Judge Grillo, and 2 lawyers as a committee to investigate those complaints. Mm-hmm. Well, we got a clear bill on the complaints. I think there were 2 questionable eligibility questions, but that's where the local lawyers actually wrote in that we shouldn't do criminal work because we were encouraging crime. That was one of them. But nevertheless, our funding was cut in half by Meskel. Mm-hmm. And by that time, we were getting into Nixon was in, and things were starting to get grumpy in Washington also.
Fred, as you look back on your time as director, which was really the most crucial time, in my opinion, in the history of legal services, what do you look at as what you were best able to achieve, and where do you think you wish you had done something different?
I wish I'd been better at raising money to counter when we got the money back, and so we could keep the independent. I liked what had developed when we had that 30-lawyer law firm, so to speak, and I wanted to protect that. And I wanted to, having been in a big law firm, I wanted to have a model where people would stay. I mean, my goal would have been for you to stay and make that a career. And that, I wish I'd done that.
If I could interrupt you, I will just say on a personal note, as far as the money raising went, I would say every month or 2 months, we would have some crisis about whether we were going to get paid. And I have to tell you, I never worried about it once because I knew that you would be able to.
Well, there were a couple of close calls. One of the problems with federal money takes a long time to sort of get approval, and then takes a long time to get paid. So we were short on cash, and fortunately a local bank helped us.
But unlike certain states and localities, you didn't have to issue script or chits or anything like that.
It was very close, but we were lucky. Yeah.
And what do you... Looking back on things, where do you think what are you happiest about?
Well, I'm happiest about, although a number of people criticize me for it, I'm happiest about sort of my management style, which I guess you'd consider loose.
Yes.
I like trying to hire the best person you can find for the job, give them training, and then really count on them to be more independent rather than top-down management.
Well, that was certainly appreciated by us lawyers. I mean,
If you get good people, I think it works better. Once in a while, you have to fire someone.
Yeah. But we basically did what we wanted to do, and you covered our asses when necessary.
And I guess the other part of my job was covering your asses.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I feel I did okay at that, of protecting you guys from all the flack that was going in.
Well, I'll certainly say for me it was the most exciting.
It was very exciting for me.
Career.
I'll bet.
To be in my 20s, and I guess this is more appropriate for my interview, but I owe a lot to you, and I appreciate it.
Take the cases you did to the U.S. Supreme Court, and change the law of due process. Yeah. Not bad.
But I do feel I owe a lot to you, and I really appreciate it.
I owe a lot to you.
That's what I have.
Is that a start? Is that right?
Do you want to add anything?
No, I don't really have.
Well, I've got, actually, there are three questions that I'd like to have you pursue. One of them, I'm not sure why this sticks in my mind, but I'm really curious about what were the lawyers paid. And there's very few days. And, you talked about, adding lots of lawyers, and I just wondered how much you were paying and how the money went around. Let's
let Dave ask.
What else?
Ask it as if you're just out of
Yeah, right.
Yeah, go ahead.
That would be one. The other is to talk a little more about some of those early impact cases that the Haven with Legal Assistance was involved in. Because there were a number of cases pretty early on.
Okay.
We'll splice it into the middle.
Yeah. And the third thing, just have Fred talk about a little bit about when he left legal aid and where you went and sort of your post legal services career too.
Sure.
Just to draw that circle.
Sure.
So we're starting again now, or we're on?
Yeah,
Okay.
Start with, tell them we're here at a certain date. You have to start the whole interview over. No, I'm just kidding.
Take that off the screen. Fred, you've talked about how you were able to add lawyers to the program and increase the scope of the neighborhood presence. And this is 2013, where starting lawyers are sometimes making over $100,000 a year. What were your lawyers being paid?
I believe they started around $7,000 or $8,000.
Yeah, that's what I remember. We got a little bonus at the end, a little raise after the first year or something.
It's about 3 or 4 times what a welfare family would get.
Yeah. And I guess particularly in the early years of the program, when you were steering it, there were a number of high-profile cases, largely in the District Court of Connecticut, and they'd sometimes, if there were 3-judge court, go up to the U.S. Supreme Court or into the Court of Appeals. And what were some of those cases, and how did you view the impact?
They divide, I was thinking about this before coming here today, they divide it into 3 areas. One area is access to the courts, and I guess that's best embodied by the Bodie or Body case.
Yes, that Arthur LaFrance.
Arthur LaFrance moved to a neighborhood office from doing criminal work, discovered there was a backlog of about 40 people that wanted divorces, talked to all of them, selected the poorest, and went to Eddie Horowitz, the clerk of the court, and asked him to waive the filing fee, and the sheriff, and I think that that went to the Supreme Court.
That inquiry by Arthur would not have been possible in the absence of a neighborhood office, because we had a backlog. Yeah. He had a backlog.
Yeah, it could have occurred at the Legal Aid Bureau, I think, or any lawyer could do it, really. But Arthur took it on and went to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And there were other cases that I would call access. There were some filing fees in criminal court, appeals from juvenile proceedings and appeals. So there are a number of cases actually just giving access, taking away the barrier of money for access. There are other cases like your Lynch case, which were really due process notice and hearing cases. There are a lot of rights being taken away from people in various areas of the law without notice or hearing. And as you know, up until that point, The 14th Amendment Due Process Clause protected personal rights, normally associated with criminal cases, but not property rights, such as Mrs. Lynch's, I forget what her wages were.
It was a bank
account that they garnished. Yeah. Household finance. Had a problem. They started a case, but before they served it, they took her money away from her. And that was won by you in the U.S. Supreme Court. Actually,
and a few other people.
And a couple of other people. And the other area, and I'm less familiar with any, I don't think any of this went to the Supreme Court, were just decisions made particularly by public entities, the welfare department, public housing, Social Security, veterans benefits, where it was necessary to litigate to put more fairness into those decisions. And I remember reading the other day a law reform report that your office produced back then, and it was produced from monthly, or at least regularly about that time. There are probably 25 or 30 cases at any one time that there were three of you, three guys, had in the courts in various stages. 3-judge federal courts, going up to the Connecticut Supreme Court, Second Court in appeals, plus for those that went to the Supreme Court.
It was a remarkable time.
Imagine. You can't reproduce it, I don't think. No, we were very lucky. No. And the best thing was just being able to get so many good lawyers and dedicated.
Yes.
Worked hard.
Yes.
Yeah, we had fun.
It was the early years.
You know what I thought? When we were getting criticized one day, I was coming back from court, and I happened to see Tom Weiss, who had become an assistant of mine, one of our good lawyers. And he was standing in our office, and he was standing actually in front of the beginning of the United States Constitution. And that sort of all brought it home to me that that's what we were trying to do, implement.
Yeah, it was a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Will you miss anything, Norm?
Only
You've heard enough. What else?
No, tell about what happened when you left Legal Aid and sort of what you've been doing.
Sure.
With David here.
Yeah, David.
Just pause here a little bit so we can blend in. All right.
So, having canvassed your career as director, what happened?
Well, I left in 1974, and I went with a small private firm in New Haven, did litigation. I employed the courtroom. I'd been away from practice for a little while, and did that. Then I went over and headed up litigation for the city of New Haven. Go over there and did that for a while. And then the Travelers Insurance Company was setting up offices to represent their insurance. And for the last 20 years of my career, I did litigation for Travelers Insurance. And to me, and I'm not proud of it at all, prior to having the kind of exposure that you and I had in legal services, I don't think many lawyers think about that, what it's like living in poverty, facing that world out there. And leaving legal services, I feel badly that I paid less attention to it than I should have. I paid some, but less than I should have. It just sort of is a period that sits there by itself. And of course, as you know, a number of the people went on to be judges, in addition to people like you that went on for successful practice. And it'd really be interesting talking and seeing how it influenced their life on the bench.
Thanks, Fred.
You're welcome.
It's fun.
Fun, yeah. Fun days to bring those back.
Yeah. The longer back it is, the more I appreciate them.